Hello folks, I'd like to welcome you once again to the Armchair Skeptic. My name is Rod. Now today I'm going to present the second of two videos on free will. The other one was basically talking about Sam Harris's idea of the non-existence of free will. I did say in that video that I'm quite a fan of Sam Harris's, and most of what he writes I think I agree with, and it's quite clever. He's a very good debater. However, I'm now taking issue with him on his idea of free will. And I'm going to, in this video, present a view of my own on free will. A view that indicates that free will is in fact not necessarily just a given, but an acquisition. Now, most people, human beings I'm talking about, do have free will in a sense, but in my view, in my argument, some people have more of it than others, right? So that it is not just simply something that's given, it's something that's acquired through what I would call a developmental process. And I'm going to be talking about what I mean by a developmental process. Now, what I have written on this will appear on the website, which is armchairskeptic.com, www.armchairskeptic.com. And I'm also going to present it as an audio blog as well, so people can listen to it in their car or wherever they might be. Now, let me just go back and look in the first video just a little bit. I sought to explain Sam Harris's view on free will in that video. And in fact, Sam Harris's book on free will was what in fact inspired me to start writing about it, because it caused me to do a lot of thinking, and what he says doesn't fit with a lot of my experience. So that's what I was motivated to do. Sam Harris's view is that of a determinist, although when you read right through his book, he tends to change a little bit. He tends to drop the determinism bit and become a bit of a compatibilist, of which he's very critical, by the way. His friend and now, unfortunately, dead, Dan Dennett, the philosopher, has written what I would call a good response to his book. Despite some people not thinking it's that very good at all, but I do. So that's a different point. Now, Sam Harris's view on free will was simply that it is a myth, it is not true, that it's impossibility. Now, just recently, in a few blogs I read of his, he's doubled down on this position and said, it is something that one needs to reject. It's a common myth, and that we don't know the origins of our thoughts. So this is what I'm going to address, and this is what I'm going to try and deal with. Now, I think I need to say that Sam Harris is a determinist and a reductionist as well, which means he argues that everything is caused by some previous cause. So you can trace back your thoughts to some cause in brain activity or whatever. However, I have to say that I'm not aware of any writers at all on this subject, and there's many of them, by the way. There's a lot of literature on free will in the philosophical literature and in some of the psychological literature, which I don't think Sam's read, actually. But nobody, not even libertarians who argue against determinism, would say that it doesn't involve some sort of brain function. Without a brain, of course, it is impossible for you to think. It is impossible to do anything. So that we're not dealing with people who actually deny that the brain has anything to do with it. Just about everybody does, because it's just common sense that the brain enables us to have consciousness and awareness and a whole range of other acquisitions the brain gives us. So nobody's denying that the brain is not involved. It's a substrate. However, with Sam's view, which I'll go into a little bit later, he seems to be saying the brain is actually doing the thinking, not the person. And he quite distinctly, and I mentioned this in the first video, separates mental activity, conscious activity from brain activity. And they're two distinct sort of processes. And in fact, our conscious activity is just simply a result of brain activity. It's just simply an outcome of brain activity. What he doesn't allow for, which I think is a fault, is that there is an interaction between the brain and mental events, conscious events, people, our experience of the world. Mental events, however, for him, have no causal impact on the brain itself. They are simply an outcome of what I would say are some sort of brain decisions. I find that difficult. And I think there is considerable evidence to indicate that thinking and activity does impact on the brain functioning itself. There is, in other words, an interaction between brain functioning and thinking, and free will is helped along, of course, by brain processes that have been altered by an individual's experience in the world. In the scientific literature, we refer to the effect of experience on the function and activity and even structure of the brain as neuroplasticity. It's also called sometimes brain plasticity. It refers to the capacity of the brain to change and adapt in structure and function in response to learning and experience. I can't find any reference to this in Sam Harris's book at all. It's really, I think, a fault. Now, I'm going to present my own view of what I would call the acquisition of free will, and I mentioned this in video 1 a little bit, and I'm going to be using to support my position two quite famous, what we call developmental psychologists. The one that I'm mostly going to use, who I know a bit about, I've done a thesis on him, is Lev Vygotsky, the Russian psychologist, who died unfortunately at a young age of 38. He was born in 1896 and died in 1934. He actually, the amount of material he wrote, it was actually incredible, and I don't think even today we've got to the bottom of what he's written. So I'm still reading him, avidly, to make sure I can pick up some extra information from it. He is a remarkable man, actually. The other person that, when you're talking about developmental psychology, you can't not mention is the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget, who has developed a very famous reputation in the West, especially in educational psychology. And he he was born actually in the same year as Vygotsky, 1898, I think, 1896, and he lived on to his 80s, 84, 85, I think, anyway. But he was a very, very important person. Now, Vygotsky and Piaget did interact with each other, as a matter of fact. I mean, Vygotsky was aware of, read everybody, Freud, J.B. Watson in America. He was an expert on the philosopher Spinoza, was keen on Engels, Marx's associate. So he was, and he knew Marxism backwards. I mean, Stalin, who was against him for a long while, tried to trick him but couldn't. He sent his agents to listen to his lectures, but they said, we can't find any fault in what he's saying. So he went through a whole lot of processes of that. He unfortunately died at 38, and his associates that worked with him had found themselves having to move out of Moscow. They moved to Kharkiv, which has become famous, on the border between Russia and Ukraine. And it became known as the Kharkiv School or the Activities School. Now they did develop Vygotsky's views, but in a different direction to what I think he was going. Now that's a debate that's been had quite a number of times many years ago. Now, when I say I'm talking about Piaget and Vygotsky, I'm very much aware that developmental psychology has moved on from those two, even though they have been influential in a whole lot of other people, and some developmental psychologists include Bronn Biner, Erik Erikson, Freud himself, Anna Freud, Freud's daughter, Barbara Rogoff, Esther Theon, a whole range of people, I can't mention them all here, have been influenced by both Piaget and Vygotsky. But I'm going to stick to Piaget and Vygotsky because they're the pioneers in the field, and I think what I've got to say can be well and truly presented by them anyway. Now, let's have a look at developmental psychology. It has a relatively long history. It was known, and still is known sometimes, as genetic psychology, from the term ontogenesis, meaning the process of the development of the individual, and recently referred to in some cases as lifespan developmental psychology. Now, originally with Piaget and Vygotsky, there was some emphasis on the acquisition of abilities, language, thought, action in childhood right up to adolescence. But recently, of course, other developmental aspects have been concerned. There's a focus on adults, even old age, even old age developmental psychology, talking about the changes that occur as you get older. So these are all important anyway. But Vygotsky and Piaget, their work does have implications for the whole of life, actually, if you read them carefully. And they are the major figures in developmental psychology, there's no doubt about that. So I'm going to be using Vygotsky to talk about the acquisition of free will, but I can't really talk about Vygotsky without mentioning Piaget, and because he's a major figure. Now, Jean William Fritz Piaget, 1896 to 1980. I won't be looking at Piaget's position in great detail, but certain aspects that are relevant to understanding Vygotsky. As I said, there was a mutual interaction between Vygotsky and Piaget. they both were familiar with each other's work, and I think Piaget's position does have some relevance in understanding what Vygotsky was saying. Piaget probably was one of the first people to study children's thinking. I mean, his position was that children are not adults. They don't think like adults. They think differently. And that we have to understand how they think, to understand how they develop their capacities. Now, this was new. I mean, a few hundred years ago, children was presented really as small adults, and even images of children in painting and things, they look like adults. It was just short. So childhood was not a highly developed concept hundreds of years ago. Piaget, emphasised the need to look at children's thinking and how it differs from adult thinking, and how adults can help children develop their thinking in a way that will enhance their ability to survive in the world. Now, Piaget's thinking is divided into stage theory. So he looks at different stages of development. The child, in fact, is partially responsible when it encounters certain aspects of reality to make adjustments to the way it looks at the world. They are quite important to understand how this happens, especially in the educational process, where you're trying to get children to develop their thinking and their abilities, not just their thinking, their physical abilities as well. Now, in the early stages of a child's thinking, Piaget said that they were, he uses the word egotistical, so self-centered. And I think the word autistic was sometimes used, but not in the current way it's being used to diagnose autism in children. So that he used the word autistic, though, however. Now, Piaget, in developing his thinking, was very much influenced by Freud. Not often known that, actually, but he mentions Freud's idea, and he focuses on Freud's idea of unconscious thinking, like the id. The id in Freud is the unconscious principle based on what we call the pleasure principle, which means that at these early stages, children seek pleasure and avoid pain. So they will do the thing that gives them some sort of satisfaction and avoid things or events or experiences that might give them a little bit of pain. So that is the pleasure principle that is the basis of a lot of Freud's thinking. In fact, for Freud and for Piaget to a certain extent, the overcoming of the pleasure principle by what we call the reality principle is what needs to occur for there to be human civilization. Now, Freud, in his book Civilization and Its Discontents, makes this exact point, that civilization is a result of a repression of the pleasure principle. The pleasure principle still dominates, but it's redirected by reality itself, so it becomes your validation. Now, Piaget himself used two terms, and I'll just briefly call them. They were assimilation and accommodation. and these were the processes whereby the child develops its thinking and its experience. Assimilation is where elements of the environment are incorporated into the organism's pre-existing mental structures. Now here we go. Here's where, what I said at the beginning, here's where experience in the world changes mental structure. Not to my view, not to my reading in Harris's work at all. And so that the child's pre-existing mental organisation is changed, in fact, by its experience in the world. Now, accommodation is the process whereby the child's existing schemes are modified in response to the environment. These two processes moves a child from one stage to another in its thinking and in its action. Just to briefly indicate something, I don't want to spend a lot of time on Piaget because he's so well known. When a child is about 2 years old, they lack up to about 2, they lack what they call object permanence. Object permanence means that we can recognise the objects in our environment exist when we see or experience them through the senses. Now, a child can't imagine something that's not in front of it. So it can't look at permanence. All that is real to a child is what it experiences in front of it. Now, this has to change, of course, because the preservation of objects in the environment that we can't see but still exists is an important stage in the development of cognitive thinking. And now, about 2 years of age, I think, children begin to use, according to Piaget anyway, they begin to use words and symbols to understand the external physical environment. They can draw images of the physical environment. They can understand it. But at this stage, there's no what we refer to as conceptual thinking. They're not thinking conceptually at all. Some people say non-conceptual thinking is a form of animism where everything in the world is alive, and it means that if you can't see it, it doesn't exist. It can also be referred to, by the way, like a solicism, which is a philosophical view which means I alone exist. Anyway, as the child grows older, the child enters a stage when they reach beyond maybe 10 or 11 years, 12 years. They begin to start to use abstract reasoning. Now, abstract reasoning is an ability to think abstractly, obviously, to think about things that are really not there. Now, the idea of these changes in stages are incredibly important that Piaget acknowledges in teaching. It indicates that children can be helped to move from one stage to another by adults. It means that an adult can organise a child's environment so that it starts to develop new ways of thinking and new ways of seeing the world. And its influence on educational practice is quite significant, actually, and still there. Now you might ask why I'm saying this about free and what's to do with free will. My point is that I've said before is that my goal is to argue that free will is not a given in humans, but an accomplishment or a skill. I consider that developmental theory might provide a way of understanding how this can be achieved. Also, developmental theory might show how human mental processes or brain activities are impacted by cultural and social integration of the child. And Piaget is one of the best theorists about this. I am to show in the following section something of Vygotsky's view of development, which is obviously he and Piaget did actually read each other's work, and the story is that I've heard that Piaget was in fact quite impressed by Vygotsky's work. Now, in the following section, I'm just going to talk about Vygotsky. I'm planning to write a special, to write an article and to present a video on Vygotsky's life. This year, 2024, is the 90th year of his death. So I think I might write something in tribute to him on the 90th, if you like to call it, anniversary of his death. Now, Vygotsky, as I said, lived from 1896 to 1934. He was very young when he died, and I've got here just a little bit of biography about him, but I'll deal with it in more detail. He was born on November the 5th, 1896, in the town of Orsha, or it's Orscha. It was in the Russian Empire, the Tsarist Empire. It is now in Belarus. Vygotsky was raised in the city of Gomel, where he was homeschooled until I think about 1911, and he obtained a formal degree with distinction in a private his family was Jewish, gymnasium. And this allowed him, because people of Jewish descent had trouble getting into universities in Russia, but this allowed him to attend Moscow University because he passed all these tests, and he passed the entry. A couple of features about Vygotsky. In 1924, he took part in what was called the All-Russian Psychoneurological Congress in Petrograd. Later it was called Leningrad, and he met with a person that was going to become a long-time colleague, Alexander Luria. Now, Alexander Luria was a person who made a study of ex-soldiers who had brain damage. Some very interesting work came out of Luria. That's worth a video in itself, actually. But Vygotsky and Luria worked together as research fellows under the direction of, I think, a person called Konstantin Kornilov. That's in the website. And he moved to, when he was accepted into Moscow University, he moved to Moscow with his new wife, Rosa Smetova, with whom he would have two daughters, one of whom, Gina, I'll be talking about her later. I've got some photos of her. She was able to, sorry, there was a break in the video just then. Anyway, he moved to Moscow with his wife, where they had 2 daughters. His oldest daughter actually, after he died, did gather together some of his manuscripts for publication. She went through his papers and that with some help from other people. Now let's get on after that brief biological information. His developmental view differed a little bit, quite significantly actually, not a little bit, from Piaget and from Freud, which I think is important. Though they all accepted an understanding of human cognitive and physical achievements could only be gained by analysis of the process of their development. They all accepted that you would only understand the developmental revolution of a child's thinking if you studied it as it develops, which is why it's called developmental psychology. And all of them took the view that innate biological processes transforms sort of the structure of the organisation of the brain, and it is important in understanding how this happens. So all of them thought there was interaction between the brain, or brain structure if you like, and experience in the world. Now Vygotsky's work was not only just focused on child development. He was interested significantly in the development of what we call the higher mental processes. Now I'm going to argue that aspects of the higher mental processes in Vygotsky's work included the ability to free will, the ability to make decisions, to think and to come to conclusions, to choose one option rather than another. And I think Vygotsky's notion of higher mental processes, which is you don't really find in Freud or Piaget, is a very important concept for us to work with. Now, Vygotsky's idea of childhood was quite a little bit different to Piaget and Freud. They argued that children, as I said, were guided by what we call the pleasure principle, and that a child acted according to the pleasure principle. Vygotsky sort of argued differently, that a child was born with an ability to take in the external environment. It wasn't an ability to survive. It meant you have to make adjustments to yourself to be able to survive in the environment. So for Vygotsky, growth develops, there is this initial innate, if you like, force that causes a child to seek to deal with reality. I mean, it's a very important thing, and you can see this in evolution, that dealing with reality once in infancy is a very important aspect of survival. If you don't do that, you don't survive. Vygotsky argued that an important aspect of development in childhood was the social or cultural environment in which they were born. And he was, he was very insistent that the child naturally sought to adjust, not just to the external environment, but to the social, the cultural environment in which it was born. So that it's quite a different idea to that. There's no overcoming of some natural destructive pleasure principle. The child is born with an ability or a need to take in those aspects of the environment, including the cultural environment, to enable it to survive. So it's a survival instinct, if you like, and it's a very important aspect of Vygotsky's position. Now, Vygotsky did have a sort of primitive view on brain plasticity. He argued, this is sort of interesting in his work, he was very much influenced by the philosopher Spinoza, the Dutch philosopher Benedictus Spinoza, originally Spanish but lived in the Netherlands, a very well-known philosopher. Now, I think this is a quote that Vygotsky often made from Spinoza, which I'll just read. It's a little bit long, but it's in its full version in the written version on the website. No one has hitherto laid down the limits to the powers of the body. It will be argued it is impossible solely from the laws of nature, considered as extended substance. We should be able to deduce the causes of buildings, of pictures, of things of that kind, which are produced only by human art, and the human body, unless it were determined and led by the mind, be capable of building a single temple. However, I have just pointed out that the objects cannot fix the limits of the body's power or say what can be concluded from a consideration of its sole nature. So, interpreting this, Spinoza's view was we don't know the limits or the powers of the human mind or the human body. There are, as far as we know, no limits to that. So that the brain and the body are open books and can, human beings have gone one way, but the brain is capable of more than what we've even achieved now. A very important aspect of Vygotsky's. Now, just a simple example of some of Vygotsky's work, I'm going to be talking about it in more detail in another video, is that he argued that development in childhood was a very important aspect of it, was adults' assistance. He developed a concept called the zone of proximal development, which has become famous since it was produced by Vygotsky. And the zone of proximal development is a zone where the child is in a situation with more competent adults, and that in this environment, the zone as it was, the child might try to perform an action or might try to make a point, but in the zone, the more competent and can't complete it because he hasn't got the skills, but what will happen in that zone is that the more competent adults or older people will fill in for the child, will enable it to do it. This is quite common, that a mother, for example, will try to read what her child wants and to produce what it wants, so that, in other words, the adult is actually fulfilling the action or the thought that the child has. In other words, in that zone, there is a position where the adult contributes and adds to the child's thinking. And that's an important part of development. I mean, there's a whole lot of books being written on the zone of proximal development, but it's a very interesting concept which must be, considered. So that this is the way a child develops by, it's the way in evolution everything develops, by assistance from more competent adults, by more competent people that surround it. They finish its thoughts, they finish its actions, and eventually there is what we call this, Vygotsky used the word internalization, so that the child internalizes what the adult has done. So the action is internalized into the thinking in the brain of the child, and that's how it learns. So internalization is a very important aspect of child development in Vygotsky, that you're internalizing what the adult has done to complete your action. And this is how development occurs. Now, this is a long video, so I'm going to finish off very quickly. There's much more in the article on the website if you want to read that. That explains a little bit more, but the important point I want to make is that as the child develops its thinking, and Vygotsky talked about the higher mental processes, and what he meant by the higher mental processes, conceptual thought, abstract thought. He argued that that was the last stage of development of a person's thinking, and that didn't occur till adolescence. And I would argue, and I'll go down presenting, that this is where free will comes in. That what a child's thinking enables it to make decisions. A child's thinking makes it, enables it to choose one action rather than another action. So that, in other words, it is an acquisition, an ability to actually be free in making decisions about what you're going to do, thinking and everything. Now, my view is that this is the only way we can look at free will, and it is true that some people might have the ability more than others. Don't know, that has to be looked at. And but the point is that thinking is a very important part of interaction with the world. Now, this is quite different to Sam Harris's views. I mean, thinking just doesn't come out of the blue like he suggests. In other words, you're not aware of what the next thought's going to be. You are aware of what the next thought's going to be, in my experience. And, like he makes an example, when I get up in the morning, I don't know whether I'm going to drink coffee or tea. That's already decided for me. It's not decided for him. He makes his mind up. He likes coffee better, maybe. It tastes better. He knows what it tastes like. I can't understand that image, that example. So that what I'm saying is that children evolve the ability to make decisions. They evolve the ability to choose a course of action rather than another course of action, because of the way their brain has been impacted on by the environment in which they live. Now that's all I'm going to say. I'm really be interested in your comments on this so I can answer them, because it's a little bit complex, and I'm interested in trying to interact with you. So thank you very much for listening all this time. I hope I've been clear enough. Some difficult concepts, and they're very difficult to get out on a video. But if you read the article on the website, you'll see that it's in much more detail and much more explanation there. So thank you very much for listening to me to the end, and I hope that you will subscribe. It's very important for me to have people who subscribe so I can interact with them, and so I can develop my next ways of thinking, my next topics for my videos. So please subscribe and come back again. I wish you well. Thank you very much.